Thank you. All right. It was a freezing and gloomy December morning, and the usual smog filled the morning air. As I exited my hotel bedroom and turned the corner, I came to notice the streets lined with beggars, sewage waste, and disheveled shops. Everyone was trying their best to stay warm in this cold, clammy place. As I strolled into the local elementary school, I was immediately flooded in a sea of running children, filled with predominantly thin and frail figures. I gently asked a small boy, "What do you eat for lunch?" To which he replied, "If I'm lucky, maybe some rice and beans." The brown population of 6 to 10-year-olds shuffled through the hallways, stuffing themselves in classrooms just so they could hear the teachers lecture on topics like mathematics, sciences, and reading. I could only hope that this young child would get a place among the millions of others of children in the underserved New Delhi community. Perhaps I shouldn't have been so optimistic. India's capital is home to over 50,000 homeless children that live in the streets, surviving on makeshift tents and homeless shelters across India's capital. The schooling conditions in many of the world's poorest countries are distressing to me, heartbreaking, considering that these are the future generation of our planet. But it's not just India. These same root problems exist in the United States as well. Educational inequality due to racial and socioeconomic barriers represents one of our 21st century's greatest challenges. Now, my love for education stems from a robust support system. I have educated parents and an older brother who helped me really master challenging concepts. But my obsession turned to fear as I saw, kids as early as elementary falling behind in core subjects like math and reading. And this was really disheartening to me. Now, in 2018 to 2019, California public schools received a total of $97.2 billion in funding from three sources: the state, property taxes, and other local authorities, and the federal government. Now, despite this large amount of funding that was put into California, our public education system still suffers immensely from benchmark disparities in reading and math. Now, even more, in multi-level models controlling for neighborhood education, neighborhood income inequality, and individual covariaties, living in a neighborhood with high education inequality was associated with a greater prevalence of drinking and smoking marijuana. Now, that means if you know any friends and family members living in lower income neighborhoods, they're more likely to engage in illicit activities than kids living in, neighborhoods with normal education equality. Now, all of these red flags were telling me that something had to be done. Now, my strides towards educational inequality actually began at my own school. So because of my high school's nature, we have, a significant amount of international boarding students. I've naturally gravitated towards building consensus among these boarding students. And I've acted on these instincts. As a class president, I was sensitive to vetting events for their inclusivity by considering people with possible language and cultural barriers, and thus advancing equality in our own schooling environment. Now, the events I helped bring to my school had visible results. We saw international student participation rates skyrocket at class events, and I still remember talking to several of my friends from China, discussing Sadie Hawkins' tradition and what it really meant to them to be a part of Fairmont's tradition. Now, what I kind of gleaned from this experience is not only did I feel that other people around me were starting to feel more part of our community, but I actually found a study that said direct gratitude plus happiness leads to students performing exceptionally well in school categories. Now, a study by Victoria Harbour's Graduate School of Education found that from elementary school to high school, happiness is positively correlated with motivation and academic achievement. She also found that the school's culture and the relationships that students are forming with their peers is directly going to play an influential role in their happiness. Now, as I talked about before, the happiness that these students are feeling will contribute to their better educational success. So I could only hope that I was helping my fellow peers by organizing dances and school-sanctioned events. Now, as I began to see how my efforts could bring my high school community together, I wanted to see how I could apply this same sort of philosophy elsewhere. And that's how I pursued a legislative internship with Congressman Krishnamurthy, who's for the 8th District of Illinois. And I dove deep into advocacy and rallying for educational rights, and as well as garnering political support for educational reform and LGBT rights. Specifically, I decided to go ahead and research Marcia Fudge's Strength and Diversity Act that devised strategies to tackle racial and socioeconomic barriers in our educational system. Now, I also suggested proposals that could help Congressman Krishnamurthy shore up more bipartisan support for the Equality Act, which would provide consistent support for LGBT people across all areas of life. Now, meeting these prominent politicians was inspiring, even if some of them enjoyed going to the Cancun more than others. If you can see Ted Cruz on the right. But anyways, much of the work that I conducted applied to the area around me. Now, surprisingly, DC's quality of education is severely low in comparison to the rest of the country. And this was shocking to me, as this is supposed to be the capital of our, great nation with some of the best educational facilities in the world. Now, in particular, DC's charter schools showed 1 in every 3 high school students in DC is dropping out of school, including 40% of low-income students. And even more, when it came to testing scores, 4th and 8th graders didn't do well in math and reading, which led to lower SAT scores. Now, these initiatives that I learned going and volunteering with a legislative official transformed my entire understanding of the legislative process and taught me that my hard work and compassion can bring about greater equality that our divided world just so desperately needs. Now, inspired by the message I discovered that I need to act and realize my dreams and goals, I started my own company, the Essential Education Enterprise, to address educational inequality, as I've talked about, due to socioeconomic and racial disparities that I identified during my legislative internship. And moreover, personal experiences in Orange County and the surrounding Los Angeles area have told me that there are way too many children that lack meaningful access to education. And honestly, these children are barely clearing benchmarks in California, if at all, and that's just truly disheartening to me as someone who cares so much about the education of the young people. Now, on my old soccer team, I played with 2 Black teammates who both lived in low-income housing. And obviously the picture is just for a visual because I don't actually have pictures of my soccer teammates. It was like a long time ago. So these aren't actually 7th and 8th grade players. But bottom line is that after practice, I would often help them with school assignments in the library right next to our soccer field. And what really was sad is that a lot of the assignments they were doing, which, were mathematics and reading, etc., were a lot of the things that I had completed in 3rd and 4th grade. So at such a young age, I'd already seen such a huge gap being formed between kids who were supposed to be completing like middle school level math, but were actually completing like elementary school level math. So that was really disheartening to me. And it reminded me of my elementary school years. So that's just horrible. Now, let's talk statistically. African American students are often being located in schools with less qualified teachers, teachers with lower salaries, and novice teachers. I'm starting to see a pattern here, right? UCLA researchers recently found that in California, our state, it's the most segregated state in the entire United States for Latinos. 58% of Latinos, that's a majority, attend intensely segregated schools. As you can see on this graphic here, there's a larger concentration of purple in California as well as Florida. Now, as a high-achieving high school student who tries to take full advantage of everything that I receive, I want to spread that same love for education back to these underserved communities of Latinos, African Americans, and anyone who just doesn't receive equal access to education. So as a result, I wanted to leverage my support system to make something happen. So my company's first project, SOS Study, was and is an online tutoring service where OC-based high school tutors mentor first-generation immigrants weekly. Now, in addition to regular academic tutoring, we are trying to provide tools so that, basic high school students, basic middle school students not only transcend what they're learning, but also can overcome language and cultural barriers to become world-class citizens. Now, besides this, I wanted to complement this effort where I launched the Essential Education podcast, which was targeting global issues that teens are facing. Now, in discussion with industry professionals, I wanted to create the guidance and perspective needed for students to thrive in their educational journeys, like mental health and racism. Now, my close friend, Milan Manick, started the podcast with the goal to discuss social issues and educational topics that are important to Generation Z and millennials. Now, our main goal with this podcast was to try and get as many listeners as possible, and in the process, try and transform their perspectives on what certain educational topics meant to them. So thankfully that worked. Now, finally, inspired by what I learned as the editor-in-chief of my school newspaper, I initiated our third offering, the Essential Education Forum. Now, this is built around a robust library of news articles collected and presented to help keep readers afloat of important educational topics in the world around us. Now, on a kind of sidebar, I distinctly remember one Hispanic immigrant I tutored named Amelia, and she was in 7th grade and lived in Ecuador all her life. Now, before any of our lessons and sessions, she could not even speak a single word of English. And this was crazy to me. She was living in the United States and she had to attend classes, and everything that went on around her was in English. But 116 lessons later and 2 months after, she was speaking almost fluently. And what helped so much is my understanding of her language, which was Spanish, and my very well understanding of English, hopefully. As a native English speaker and somewhat fluent Spanish speaker, I was able to construct lessons and guides based on teaching her what she could, just so that she could become a better speaker. And what the satisfaction that I gleaned from this experience was truly one of the most heartwarming and just most rewarding experiences that I've ever had as someone that has tutored another student. And thus far, as an entire enterprise, we've helped over 20 scholars surpass basic benchmarks in reading and math, if they weren't doing so before, which is just so big for me as someone that strives to combat educational inequality. Now, on that note, educational inequality as a whole is representing one of the most significant problems facing our 21st century. We're seeing millions of children every day lacking the resources and fundamental to their development and prosperity towards blossoming into young adults. Now, consequently, I'm passionate about bringing about an equal world where we are defined by more than just our birth circumstances. And in turn, we're defined by our passions and dreams. So I intend to continue to apply myself and the lessons I learn in order to be, more proactive in the communities that I'll be a part of. And I hope that by, having this head talk, I've put an even bigger spotlight on the issues that we should care about so much, our world's greatest unfortunate inequalities. Thank you.